Hello. Well, we're into our third week, and these weeks are going fast. I know that you have plenty of reading to do because I've done it too, so I know how it's going. But let me also keep you in mind that because I am just trying to highlight the theory so you'll have maybe a little premise or focus of it, don't think that, oh, wow, that's good. That theory is very short. No, they're not. There are lots of writers and research on any of these theories, but just want you to keep that in mind. Now, this week we're looking at Chapter 8. And it is quite exciting because when you think about it, Chapter 8 looks at social disorganization, Anamede, and then also strain theory. Anamede and strain are pretty much connected. They're not necessarily the same. There is some difference between them, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But let me start out talking about social disorganization first. Social disorganization is kind of tied to the social ecology area. This is an area that came out of the University of Chicago. In fact, for those of you who know a little history, you know that probably sociology really grew there in the University of Chicago first. One of the first areas, the Department of Sociology at the University of Chicago. Anyway, that's kind of history, and you can deal with that a little bit later on. The ideal behind, or the premise behind social disorganization is that the conventional norms have been disturbed. They are actually broken. They are no longer working. And the reason they are not is because you've got people moving into areas. Now, you really have to go back and look at Shaw and McKay and some of their early writings. And this is when cities were being developed. And this is what they focused on. They saw the inner part of the cities, in which we call today inner city. And no one wants to live in the inner city. Although I take that back now, you know that, for instance, Dallas is now having that kind of revolution. They're coming back into the inner city. So you want to kind of keep that in mind, but that's kind of a sidebar, no big deal about that. What happened was that as the cities grew, people would move into them, and especially immigrants would move into the inner cities. And so what happened was that there were people who were not necessarily following the values and the norms of the major culture. Now, I'm not going to digress about that, but we can talk about that off sidebar at some point if you want to. But what was happening is that these inner areas were becoming dilapidated. People were taking advantage of each other. And so when you follow Shaw and McKay, and in their writing Social Disorganization, they said those inner city areas were just terrible. People didn't respect each other's life, each other's property. They had people moving in and moving out, so there was no allegiance. They even talked about a great deal of heterogeneity, not homogeneity. And so they said that those areas were just deplorable. Social disorganization, there was a breakdown of the traditional values and cultures. And so they said then what you have is a festering of criminal activity. People who had no allegiance. They didn't own the property. They were renting. So it didn't make them any difference whether they tore up the property or not. So you got to kind of keep this in mind as you read that chapter, and you especially think about social disorganization. The society, the culture area around those inner city areas were really becoming dilapidated. You had absent landlord. You had people who didn't keep their property up. And so all of that then kind of festered. And even today in inner city areas, you can see some of those areas where people are just barely hanging on. You see a great deal of maybe homelessness. You see drug activity. You see prostitution. And so that's what they really addressed when they talked about social disorganization. Now, we got to keep that in mind as we move through this chapter. And you'll want to keep in mind some of the other theories that we'll talk about in just a moment. I really hope that you're enjoying this week. These theories are interesting because in this particular chapter, a number of people fault those individuals who are of lower class. Now, I have to be honest with you. I do understand how lower class people have a more difficult time in our society. But I also have to say that not all lower class people are criminals. So please keep that in mind. And so I'm not trying to stereotype, but these theories are interesting because they do cover, and notice now, we haven't said anything really about learning, because in this area we're talking more about the social environment, the area in which people grow up in. People who have less, people who grow up deprived, and I know that probably could need to be explained somewhat, but these are people who are more likely to become criminals. These are people who are more likely to be dealt with. Again, some of you are probably police officers, so you see this. And so you have to deal with those individuals more than you do with the middle class or the upper middle, or especially those who live in very ritzy areas. But let's go back and focus on, now what we're going to talk about is Anomie, A-N-O-M-I-E, and also strain theory. They do have a connection. Because in the early part, when you talked about anomie, which means normlessness, or I also say a state of lawlessness. You've got people who will disregard the norms. So when you look at Durkheim and Merton and in their writing, what they suggested was that because people wanted to make economic gains and they were blocked socially, because if you have a limited education, but you still want some of the things that our society, say for instance, American society throws at you, like having nice cars, good clothing, those kinds of things, those things that you can see readily, people want those. And so if they can't get them because they don't have, they have a limited education, they're likely to engage in other behavior. And so what you have to think in terms of, as you read the theories here, is that people will find other ways to get at what they want. And in this case, they want to be successful. So what can I do? Well, I can possibly sell drugs. Maybe I get involved in prostitution, or maybe I burglarize someone's house, and I do that very constantly, so I become kind of a professional thief. Anyway, what you want to look at as you read through this theory on strain and anomie, you want to think in terms of people wanting to be successful, but they cannot be under the circumstances in which they operate in. And so crime, deviation then becomes that kind of a alternate route that will get them to where they want to be. Let's just face it. You know, you look at some of the people who are selling drugs, they probably have a mint of money. And they probably have a great deal of what? Notoriety or celebrity in their neighborhood. And so, again, that's what some people want. And so if drugs, if money, if crime will bring all of that, then that is what they get engaged in. Now, the whole gist is that these people are stressed. They cannot survive under the present system of which we have, so they create a system that works best for them. And unfortunately, criminal activity becomes that avenue of success. It helps to alleviate the strain or the frustration that they're feeling by not being able to be successful through the regular route. Now, that's Burton and Durkheim's task or explanation on that in terms of why criminal behavior exists. Now, let me add something to this, because what happened probably back in maybe the mid-90s, Robert Agnew started writing, and let me just throw in, I know Robert Agnew, and actually had a conversation with him several times. His ideal is, okay, let's expand strain theory. Let's not just focus on economy or economics, but let's look at why do people commit crimes, not just because of the money, but maybe because there's motivation. Maybe there's a negative stimuli that he will talk about, he does, and he says that people want to get out from under that. They want their reaction to that. He says that people lose maybe a positive stimuli. And so what happened, he talks about, is the motivation to commit crime because you want to get out from under the strain. And it may not necessarily be an economic. He talks about a loss of a loved one. Some people just feel hopeless, and there's nothing that can happen to them worse than losing a loved one. And so they themselves then may go and commit some kind of crime. So what he does, Agnew looks at, he talks about broadening the field of strain. And so you want to get a difference of that when you read both of those theories. Again, you've got Merton and Durkheim talking about anomie, and then you've got Agnew talking about what he calls a general strain theory. And the focus is that he broadens the strain explanation to say not only is it money, but it may be loss of a loved one, a loss of a positive stimuli, the introduction of a negative stimuli, saying, for instance, maybe an argument with your parents or your teachers. That could very well influence an individual to go and commit a crime. So keep those in mind as we move through this chapter on social disorganization, and more so that they all connect to the environment on which a person lives in. That's why we call it the social structure paradigm. Again, I hope that you're enjoying this chapter. Again, these theories are exciting. They help us to understand human behavior. So I want to emphasize just a few more ideals here in this last chapter that we've been looking at on social structure. It's been looking at social disorganization, strain theory, anomie. There's a section, and probably Acre doesn't really focus on it a lot, but I'm just going to throw it at you anyway, and it's there, some of the theories. There's a group of theories that we could put under a subheading, not the main heading, but the subheading that we call cultural deviance or cultural conflict. Now, don't let this get confused with looking at Marx, because that's not what we're going to do in this chapter. We'll see Marx in the conflict theories in another chapter. In fact, that's a chapter that you're going to have to read on your own. But in this case, what I'm concerned about, for instance, like there's Cohen has a theory on delinquent subculture, and where he talks about, again, people coming up in poor environments, and these individuals, especially when he looked at juvenile or juvenile delinquency, these were individuals who were coming up in the areas, they were not successful in school, and so they had to figure out a way how could they then keep their self-ego satisfied or feel okay. And so what happened is that they started participating in crime. So they took all of, Cohen says, he says this, and it's an interesting thought. He says that they take all of the middle class values and they turn them upside down. So as opposed to expecting or respecting, a person's property, they don't care about a person's property or a person's life. So keep in mind that they turn all of the middle class values upside down. And so what happens is that they're able to commit crime, and they're okay about that. They realize that it is through these areas then that they become successful, that they feel good about themselves. In fact, some of you, again, if you work in the criminal justice area, some of you will run across people who are very street smart. They really don't read very well. They may not speak well, but they are very savvy in surviving on the street. And some of these kids are very young in being able to do that. And so this would be the group that Cohen would be talking about when he looks at delinquent subculture. Another area, another theory in the same area would be Walter Miller's theory, focal concern. And so his theory focuses on the importance or the emphasis that are placed on individuals living in, let's say, the lower class, who don't and can't operate by middle class values. So again, they create a system that works best for them. So as you read through the chapter, you'll see this focal concern, which is an interesting area. Focal, just maybe another word for focal would be focus, or primary, something of that nature would be another word that you could substitute for that. Also in this same chapter, you will run across, definitely we've got to look at this then, and that is Seitz and Matzah's theory, techniques of neutralization. And so what they suggest is, okay, you've got people who are growing up in these areas, and they will neutralize the behavior that they commit. They will give themselves a good reason. Some people say rationalization. They give themselves a false explanation, but it's good for them in terms of what they do. Now, so when you digest Seitz and Matzah's writing, you'll know they'll talk about some techniques of neutralization. One of those being, for instance, denial of injury. You know, they can snatch the purse of an older lady, push her down or something, and they'll just say, well, there's really no victim. She should have given me the purse without having to give me a hassle, something of that nature. So it's really interesting. Again, they talk about how individuals in a certain environment, and especially we say lower class environment, which may very well engage in criminal activity, and they can rationalize what they do. And that helps them to get through the run of the day, through their life, and not feel bad about it. Anyway, so what we've done in this particular chapter this week is we've looked at a number of theories, social structure oriented, talking about the environment of the people. And so hopefully you're enjoying that reading. If not, well, what can I say?